What's up, squad? It's your Squid, and today I'm finally telling you about what is affectionately known in the Australian political circles as the Gillard-Rudd years. In my opinion, they almost ruined the entire Labor Party, federally and at a state level, and they're kind of the reason that politics has been such a mess in Australia for the last decade or so. Of course, it should go without saying that I think it's all John Howard's fault. It's all in a reaction to that, and it's a bunch of people that don't know what they're doing because they've had a generation of not doing it, but I digress, right? The rest of this script was helped to be written by Google's AI, Bard, and I'm going to be giving you a whole bunch more Australian history stories in the next few weeks as a result of my newfound love for Bard. It's been helping me write these scripts that I've been waiting years to write, and yeah, I hope you enjoy it moving forward. If this is the first time you've stumbled across me, please don't just judge me based on this video. I might be having an off day. Poke around, decide if you like me based on watching a few other videos. I've got a bunch of different playlists. Most of my videos are shorts these days, and yeah, I could really do with your help in terms of likes, comments, shares, all that sort of stuff. You know how YouTube works, and it would really help me out if you could do your bit for me. Anyway, let's get right into it. Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were two of the most prominent figures in Australian politics from the 2000s to the 2010s. In fact, they were probably the most prominent. They were both members of the Australian Labor Party, or ALP, and they both served as Prime Ministers of Australia at one point. However, their relationship was often fraught with tension, and you would not be able to describe it as a positive working relationship at the best of times. They were ultimately rivals, not just for the leadership of the ALP, but also for the direction they wanted the country to go in. This video essay will attempt to explore the factional differences between the left faction and the right faction in the Australian Labor Party, led by the left Kevin Rudd and the right Gillard respectively at that time. It'll attempt to analyse not just those factions, but the role that the factional politics played in the mess that was Australian politics at the time. I'm talking leadership spills, all the drama on Sunrise, and all the back and forth backstabbing or backroom deals, as you might have heard of them now. I'm trying to explain why it was a mess, basically. Before we do that, I think we need to know a little bit more about Kevin Rudd as a person and Julia Gillard as a person, so let's do that first. Kevin Rudd was born on the 21st of September in 1957, and his parents were just a stay-at-home parent and a rail worker. Must be nice. He went to public schools his entire high school and public school life, and after high school, he studied Asian studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. Hey look, I moved. After graduating with first-class honours in 1978, Rudd went off to work as a diplomat in Beijing and in Stockholm, and he also served a stint as the Chief of Staff for Queensland Premier Wayne Goss. It's worth mentioning Goss because he was the first Queensland Premier on the left in about 30 years after an entire generation of, like, right-wing austerity, and Rudd would sort of emulate that on a federal level, but I'll get to that point. In 1996, Rudd was elected to the House of Representatives as the member for Griffith, and throughout the next 9 years would be given a bunch of shadow ministry roles, which is like effectively like the opposition, you know, well, not effectively, it is the opposition. It's the opposite role to the person who's actually in charge of the portfolio for my non-Australian friends. Anyway, he had some opposition shadow ministries, whatever you want to call them, and in 2007, he ended up becoming the leader of the Labor Party. And we'll pause there so I can give some context about Julia now. Julia Gillard was born on the 29th of September in 1961, and she was actually born in Wales. Coincidentally, she also had a rail worker for a father, except her mother wasn't a homemaker, she was a teacher. They all emigrated to Australia when Gillard was around 5, and education-wise, Gillard was afforded a private school education from the point she arrived. After graduating high school, she would attend university and enroll in 1979 in the University of Adelaide. Unlike Rudd, she wasn't studying any humanities degree, she was studying law like the vast majority of politicians. And if you're a regular viewer of mine, it's probably around about this point in the video that you're realising the reason I don't like Julia Gillard when compared to Kevin Rudd is one of them is from a working class family that has advocated for working class values their entire life, and the other one is not. But anyway, while we're on a sidetrack, I like money. Turning some of your money into mine on a monthly basis would be ideal. Consider joining the channel. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Spend some money with Milkman Grooming. Just, yeah, help me out. You know all the YouTube stuff. Let's get back into the action. After graduating from university in 1986, Gillard went and worked for Slater & Gordon, who are Australia's biggest corporate law firm. She specialised in industrial law and would go on to represent unions in big-time, class action lawsuits, but she was still a lawyer, and she was still in corporate law as opposed to the humanities, like I said before. In 1996, Julia became the Chief of Staff to Victorian Premier John Brumby, and that's worth mentioning because he only became Premier when the previous Premier had been sacked and he replaced him, i.e. he wasn't democratically elected into the role, and then he got voted out the first chance they got. So much like Kevin Rudd emulating his former political mentor, Gillard would end up doing the same thing as well. They share very similar stories in the lead up to their political careers, and it's probably for that reason that it won't surprise you to hear that Gillard ended up being Kevin Rudd's 2IC, deputy, running mate, whatever you want to call it. She was the deputy leader of the party in 2007, and now we have reached that point in the video. The lead up to the 2000 federal election was more a story about how people were sick of John Howard than a story about how they absolutely fervently approved of Kevin Rudd. And yet Kevin Rudd would still win the election in 2007. So in regards to context about John Howard and about the 2007 federal election, I want you to go and watch my video, Why John Howard Really Sucked. If you don't, you can just take my word for it. He really sucked. And it wasn't really a result of Kevin Rudd having an approval or a mandate at that election for the reason that he won. It was just a bunch of people voting for anything other than John Howard. Julia Gillard knew that the landslide victory in 2007 was more about not being John Howard than being Kevin Rudd. But Kevin Rudd viewed the landslide victory in 2007 as a mandate to do absolutely everything that he personally wanted to do on the left side of politics. With the power of hindsight, he should not have gone as hard as he did, because after a generation of austerity from John Howard, Kevin Rudd needed to be seen as the reasonable and caring leader that he was. But he went too hard and tried to Gough Whitlam himself. So he thought he had a mandate, but everyone was really just going, oh Christ, not that guy, anyone but that guy. Which meant that he started moving really fast and breaking stuff to, steal a term from, I think it's Facebook. I'll read you from a list here, right, of all the things he was doing. But it's worth remembering that this is all within his first term, after we've had a leader that had like 6 of them. And it's all within the first half of his first term, because he didn't last a full term before Gillard knifed him, right? He withdrew Australian troops from Iraq. He signed the Kyoto Protocol on climate change. He forged closer ties with China and other Asian nations. This is a bloke that studied Asian studies, right? He speaks fluent Mandarin. Like, it was a dangerous path when it comes to, talking about CIA interference in Australia and all that sort of stuff. Like, if Kevin Rudd was still the leader in Australia, we would not have recently signed that nuclear deal. Like, let's just put it that way. He introduced a new tax system that was fairer for lower and middle income workers. He increased the funding for education and healthcare. He introduced a number of other policies aimed at improving the lives of Australians. And he was very popular to begin with. But then the Murdoch media started harping on about all the money he was spending, and it got to a point of, oh, hang on, is he moving too fast and breaking too much stuff? It's not just a cynical take to say that Julia Gillard saying there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead was one of the reasons that she won the election in 2010, and her backtracking on that promises, on those promises, is the exact reason that the Murdoch media went so hard and Abbott was able to, without putting too fine a point on it, absolutely annihilate her from that point forward and run her out of Australian politics. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's recap, right? John Howard, Liberal Party austerity for a whole bunch of years. Kevin Rudd wins an election against him as the leader, and Julia is his deputy, and he feels like he has a mandate for his left-leading, humanities, Asian-based policies moving forward, whereas Julia Gillard is perfectly aware that an inanimate carbon rod could have beaten John Howard in that election, and that he doesn't have a mandate to go wild, he has a mandate to not be John. The Murdoch media are going hard on the "is this what we really wanted" angle, and the Australian public are looking at it and going, well, actually, shit, like, I'm not sure if this is what we wanted. We didn't want John because he was being an asshole, but we don't want to also get rid of all our assets or, like, throw all our toys out of the cot just because we don't have John anymore either. Like, we need to be reasonable about this. And now's the point in the video where we're going to talk about the history of factional politics in the Labor Party, because all it needed was a couple of pokes to stoke the flames of chaos that we then saw for the next 6 years. The Australian Labor Party has always had factions since it very first started, but since the 1970s, it's had formal left and right factions that you could pay a membership fee to, in addition to the fact that you were already paying a membership fee to the Labor Party. Currently, the factions are led by, obviously, Anthony Albanese on the left, and Bill Shorten on the right. Bill Shorten gets an honourable mention at this point, or more accurately, a dishonourable mention, because he was the bloke that was in Julia Gillard's ear the whole time about getting rid of Kevin Rudd because he was spending too much money. And he was the bloke signing all the backroom deals that people would get offended about later on, and, like, he was the puppeteer. It is not hyperbole to suggest that he was the puppeteer surrounding the entire Rudd-Gillard-Rudd feud, and he stood to benefit greatly from it. Like, he led the Labor Party after that feud for a few elections that he just kept losing because he was not what anyone wanted. He wasn't what the people who hated John Howard wanted. He wasn't what the Labor Party wanted. He was just who was left. But I digress. The history of factionalism in the Labor Party is long and complex, but it can be pretty much boiled right down to the fact that early on in the party it was progressives versus protectionists. And it's pretty much continued along that track for the last 120 odd years, and it's now, you know, progressives versus conservatives, which is just a new label on the same old thing, you know? In a nutshell, the Labor left believe in, state intervention and social reform, whereas the Labor right believe in free markets. So Rudd beat Howard, and then Rudd went on a bit of a tear, spending a bunch of money and uplifting society by, you know, creating or maintaining services that had not been created or maintained in a generation. However, the Murdoch press went gangbusters, suggesting that, you know, the money he was spending could not be clawed back and, you know, was not a worthy thing to be spending the money on. And people were getting scared because change is difficult. And changing of a federal parliament after the length of time we'd gone without doing so is scary. So Murdoch took advantage of that fear, and so did Bill Shorten. To Kevin Rudd's credit, he saw the writing on the wall, and he could see that those members of his party were, you know, not doing what he wanted to be done, and so he started making what would be referred to as captain's call. The term captain's calls wouldn't be coined until Tony Abbott would start doing the same thing, but, like, it is such a good title for effectively saying, nah, I'm not going to collaborate, I'm gonna not listen to you, you don't know what you're talking about, I'm the leader of the party, we're doing it my way. Which, you know, is a very American style of doing things politically, but was not the way we did things in Australia up until that point, and hasn't been since either. So, became a point of contention in and of itself, even though it was in response to a point of contention. Because she was more moderate than Kevin Rudd, both perception-wise and in reality, Julia Gillard thought she would be a better leader of the Labor Party than he was. Due to that ambition being well known, it was reported at the time that key influential figures amongst the Labor Party were advising her that she should challenge Kevin Rudd for the leadership of the party. Anyone with a brain knows that those key influential figures were Bill Shorten, right? But it wasn't reported that way at the time, and, you know, you'd have to go out of your way to find it being reported now as well. But it is a fact. That is Bill Shorten. Bill Shorten was the one telling her to do that. And so despite no Prime Minister in Australia's history ever being challenged for the leadership of his party in his first term, she did so. She challenged him for the leadership of the party and she won by a very narrow margin in the middle of the night one evening, so the press woke up the next day to a new Prime Minister. Gillard challenged Rudd for the leadership of the Labor Party in June of 2010, and the federal election that year was in November. She thought she'd given herself enough time to explain all the reasons that she had done what she'd done to the Australian people and to make clear that the Labor Party were going to be different moving forward, that they weren't going to be as reckless and that they weren't going to spend as much money. She figured that the Australian public would warm to her and would be okay with the fact that she'd done with what she had done because of all of those justifications. As it turned out, the Australian public saw no justification for doing what they saw as an undemocratic thing. The levers were all there for her to do what she did, and she didn't do anything against the law, without a doubt. However, it's a fact that Australians went to bed one evening with one Prime Minister, and they woke up the next day with another one, and they just weren't okay with that at the end of the day. That 2010 federal election was an extremely poor showing for the Labor Party, and the only reason that Julia Gillard was able to form government after that was via negotiation with the independents who had won seats in the government or the parliament also. It was what was called a hung parliament, and to her credit, she passed more laws than anyone in the history of parliament ever within that hung parliament, but a lot of that can be put down to the fact she had to negotiate a lot, you know? Like, yeah, okay, we'll pass this law as long as you also pass that law. But credit where it's due, the NDIS happened under her stewardship. Like, there's a lot of good things that occurred between 2010 and 2013. But the manner in which she came into power was always going to be her downfall and continued to be a talking point throughout the entire time that she was leader. I realise this video is longer than a quarter of an hour now, and I can't give you a definitive answer for one person who was definitively at fault, right? You know, there was Bill Shorten's manipulation, there was Gillard's ambition, and there was Rudd's lack of personableness, you know, his captain's calls, for lack of a better term, and let's just, you know, put it blankly, his childishness after he had been taken down a peg, you know, like he spent the 2010 to 2013 period absolutely poking and stoking and undermining Julia Gillard wherever he could because he was bitter about the way that she had taken power. Yes, and, you know, she did take power in a manner that I agree was poor, and he had every right to be bitter, but it was to the detriment of the Labor Party as a whole that he was that way. In 2013, just before the federal election, Kevin Rudd would beat Julia Gillard in a leadership ballot for the leadership of the Labor Party and become Prime Minister again. However, it was effectively just for optics, because there were no more sitting sessions of Parliament, there was no more opportunity for him to actually do anything as Prime Minister. They were just changing the face that would inevitably lose to Tony Abbott at the next election, because it was a fait accompli at that point. The Labor Party only took 3 years to take what was a gift in Howard's ineptitude and senility in the landslide victory of 2007 and absolutely fumble the bag completely, dropping it politically by 2010 and then dragging the lifeless corpse of their party along for 3 years until finally losing out in 2013. After the Labor Party lost that election, Bill Shorten would become the leader, as he intended. Obviously, there's nothing to confirm that, but as I was saying, he intended it that way, and he would go on to, you know, be the most boring opposition leader in the history of the country. He was not a good opposition leader. He lost several elections, and it wasn't until Anthony Albanese took over the leadership of the party and, you know, regained a bit of identity for the Labor Party that they won the election in May of 2022 and are now serving in government finally again. There are absolutely different periods where you could claim that Rudd was completely at fault for the chaos that was occurring, or that Gillard was completely at fault for the chaos that was occurring. But at the end of the day, the fault or the blame for the chaos that was Australian politics during the Rudd and Gillard feud, or the Rudd and Gillard era, falls 50% on Kevin Rudd's head and 50% on Julia Gillard's. That's it. You know what I mean? And that's the end of this video, guys. As I said at the start, they nearly tore apart the fabric of the Labor Party. Nearly. They didn't, but it was a fucking wild period for a while there. So if you enjoyed this video or you found it informational or interesting, please share it with someone. I'm trying to get as many views as possible this month. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'm trying to drive up my subscribers as well. You know how YouTube works. And if you have a bit of spare cash, I know, right? Who has spare cash? No one has spare cash these days. But if you pay for services like Netflix or Disney or HBO or whatever, you know, but you find yourself watching YouTube more than those things, consider where your money might be better spent and, you know, support some YouTube creators. I'm not saying me, but consider joining the channel. I like money. Turning some of your money into my money on a monthly basis would be awesome, you know what I mean? So, failing that, let me know in the comments section below what you want me to look into next. My kid has been very, very good. My kids have been very, very good. So yeah, let me know in the comments section what you want me to do another video on. I'm gonna go and play with them, and I'll see you when I look at you. You'll see me when you look at me. Thanks so much for watching, guys.